Grace thought she'd buried her past in the snow 3 years ago, but as she stared at the black envelope on her counter, she realized the Mafia doesn't forget, and Fang never lets go of what belongs to him. The scissors snicked through the stem of a long-stemmed red rose, the sound sharp in the quiet of the shop. Grace didn't look up. She liked the scent of damp earth and petals. It was the only thing that could drown out the phantom smell of expensive cologne and ozone she'd been running from for 3 years. Her hands, dark and steady against the green leaves, were her pride. They no longer shook. She was a ghost in the city, a nobody living in a one-bedroom apartment, and she preferred it that way. But as the bell above the door chimed, a cold draft followed. Grace felt the hair on her arms rise before she even saw him. It wasn't him, it was one of them. A man in a suit too expensive for this neighborhood, holding a black envelope like it was a weapon. "Mr. Kim expects you for dinner," the man said. His voice was a flat stone. "Tonight, it's Christmas Eve, Grace." Grace didn't take the envelope. She gripped the counter until her knuckles turned gray. "I don't know a Mr. Kim anymore." Across the city, in a penthouse that felt more like a glass cage, Fong stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. The lights of Seoul blurred into a smear of gold and white. He was a man of jagged edges and ironed silk. His knuckles were bruised, a reminder of the meeting he'd just finished. But his eyes were fixed on the small, crumpled Polaroid in his palm. It was Grace laughing in a sun-drenched park years ago. He looked at his reflection in the glass. A monster in a $5,000 suit. He hated the holidays. They were a reminder of the silence his power had bought him. He checked his watch. He had spent 3 years convincing himself he was protecting her by staying away. Tonight, his selfishness had won. The iron gates of the Kim estate groaned open like the jaws of a predator. Grace sat in the back of the black sedan, her breath hitching as the tires crunched over the pristine snow. She wore a deep emerald dress, the color he used to say made her look like royalty. She hated herself for remembering. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the front door opened, spilling a warm, amber glow onto the white driveway. She stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble foyer. She expected to see guards, weapons, or the cold business of a syndicate. Instead, she found a house transformed. A towering fir tree stood in the center of the hall, decorated with white lights and glass ornaments. The scent of pine and cinnamon was aggressive, almost offensive in its domesticity. "You came," a voice rasped from the shadows of the mezzanine. Fang descended the stairs slowly. He had traded his usual tactical gear and sharp suits for a charcoal cashmere sweater. He looked softer, younger, and infinitely more dangerous because of it. Stopped 3 feet away, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat, lingering on the pulse he knew was racing. "I didn't think I had a choice," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "Your men don't exactly take no for an answer, Fang." "Tonight you have every choice," he said, stepping closer. The air between them hummed with 3 years of static. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, before he caught himself and pulled back. "I didn't invite you here for business, Grace. I invited you for dinner. Just dinner." He led her into the dining room. The long mahogany table was set for only 2. Crystal glasses shimmered under candlelight, and a feast that could feed 20 sat between them. It was a scene of staggering loneliness. Fong pulled out her chair, his fingers brushing her shoulder. The contact felt like a live wire. "Why now?" she asked, her eyes stinging. "Why after 3 years of silence?" Fong sat opposite her, the flickering candle casting dancing shadows across the scar on his jaw. Because the silence was starting to sound like a death sentence. The silver fork clattered against the china, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Grace pushed her plate away, the gourmet food tasting like ash. "This is a mistake," she snapped. standing up so abruptly her chair screeched. You think you can just buy a Christmas tree and some wine and erase what happened? You're a ghost, Fang, and I spent 3 years learning how to live without being haunted. Fang didn't move. He swirled the dark red wine in his glass, his expression unreadable. You're still wearing the perfume I bought you in Busan, he said quietly. Grace froze. Her hand flew to her neck. It was on sale, don't flatter yourself. Sit down, Grace. No, I'm leaving. She turned toward the foyer, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached the heavy oak doors and pulled. They didn't budge. She pulled again, panic rising in her throat. Open the door, Fang. I knew this was a trap. He appeared behind her, not touching her, but his presence was a wall of heat. The locks are automatic after 8. Security protocol. My men are on high alert tonight because of the holiday. It's when rivals like to strike. He leaned over her, his hand pressing against the wood of the door, boxing her in. You're not a prisoner, but you're not safe out there alone tonight. Not after my car was seen picking you up. Grace spun around, her chest heaving. You did this on purpose. You put a target on my back just to force me to stay in this house. I did it because I'm a selfish man, he admitted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. I spent 3 years watching you through a lens, making sure no one touched you. But tonight, I needed to see if you still looked at me with that spark of fire, or if I'd finally managed to kill everything you felt for me. There's nothing left but hate, she lied, her voice breaking. Fang leaned in, his breath hitting her lips. Then stay and use that hate to ruin me. But don't walk out into the snow, not yet. Nature seemed to conspire with Fang's intent. Outside, the wind howled, whipping the snow into a white-out curtain that erased the city of Seoul from view. The power flickered, the grand chandeliers dimming before the backup generators hummed to life, leaving the mansion bathed in a low, amber twilight. The roads are impassable, Fang said, walking toward the fireplace. He knelt to stir the embers, the orange light carving out the hard planes of his face. Even my drivers can't get a car through the mountain pass in this. You're stuck here, Grace. At least for the night. Grace stayed by the door for a long time, her fingers still curled around the cold brass handle. Finally, the chill of the hallway won. She walked into the library, wrapping her arms around herself. This house is too big, she whispered, looking at the floor-to-ceiling shelves. It feels like a tomb. It is, Fang replied. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid and held one out. When she took it, his fingers brushed hers, lingering this time. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. They sat on the leather sofa, kept apart by a deliberate foot of space. The only sound was the crackle of the wood and the distant moan of the wind. Do you remember the cabin in Jeju? Fang asked suddenly. Grace's heart skipped. I try not to. We had nothing then, he mused, staring into the fire. No titles, no empire, just a radio that barely worked and a space heater. I was happier in that drafty shack than I've been in this palace. You chose the palace, Fang, Grace said, her voice soft but sharp. You chose the blood and the gold over the life we talked about. He turned to look at her, his eyes raw with a hunger that wasn't physical. I chose the gold so I could build a wall, high enough to keep you safe. I just didn't realize I was building it between us. Grace stood up, her restlessness driving her to pace the perimeter of the library. She stopped at a heavy oak desk, her eyes catching a drawer that wasn't fully closed. Tucked inside was a small velvet box and a weathered piece of paper. Before Fang could intervene, she pulled it out. It wasn't jewelry, it was a dried, pressed flower from her shop, a simple white carnation, and a medical report from 3 years ago. Her eyes scanned the kanji and medical jargon. Gunshot wound, spinal proximity, critical blood loss. The date matched the night she had fled. You told me you let me go because you were bored of me," Grace whispered, the paper shaking in her hand. "You said I was a distraction, and that you'd found someone else." Fang stood, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached for the hem of his cashmere sweater and pulled it over his head. Grace gasped, dropping the paper. Across his shoulder blade and trailing down his spine was a horrific, jagged knot of scar tissue. It looked like a bolt of lightning had been seared into his skin. "The council didn't want you to leave, Grace," Fang said, his voice a jagged edge of pain. "They saw you as a liability, a weakness they could use to control me. I had to make them believe I hated you so they wouldn't hunt you down. And I had to pay the exit fee for your life." "You took a bullet for my freedom," she breathed, stepping toward him. Her hand reached out, her fingertips finally touching the cold, raised skin of the scar. He flinched at the contact, a low groan escaping his throat, but he didn't pull away. "I wanted you to hate me," he confessed, turning to face her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Hate is a strong shield. If you hated me, you'd stay far away from the blood. But every night for 3 years, I've felt the ghost of your hand on this scar. I didn't invite you here to reclaim you, Grace. I invited you here because I'm dying from the cold, and you're the only son I've ever known." The weight of the truth crashed over her. All the anger she had used to protect herself began to dissolve, leaving only the raw, aching love she had tried so hard to kill. The tension that had sustained their 3-year separation snapped, replaced by a gravity neither could resist. Grace didn't pull her hand away from the scar. Instead, she moved closer, her palm flattening against his warm chest. She could feel his heart thudding, a wild, trapped animal beneath his ribs. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice thick with the tears she refused to let fall. "We could have fought them together." "I am a man of war, Grace," Fang replied, his hands tentatively finding her waist. "You were the only piece of peace I had left. I couldn't let them stain you." He led her to the window where the blizzard had turned into a soft, hypnotic swirl of white. For the first time in years, the boss was gone. In his place was just a man named Fong, who had missed the sound of a specific laugh. They talked, not of the Mafia or the blood, but of the small things. He asked about her flower shop, and she told him about the stubborn cat that lived in the alley. He told her about the books he'd read to fill the silence of the mansion. For a few hours, the world outside ceased to exist. Fong put a record on an old gramophone, a slow, soulful melody that filled the gaps between their heartbeats. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. It wasn't a dance of passion, but of homecoming. "I used to imagine this," he murmured into her hair. "Just one night where I didn't have to look at the door or check my holster. Just a night where I was just yours." Grace pulled back just enough to look into his dark eyes. The hardness had melted into something vulnerable and terrifyingly honest. "You were always mine, Fang, even when I was trying to forget you existed." She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, and drew him down. The kiss was slow, tasting of salt and old promises. It felt like healing, a bridge built over a canyon of regret. The record player's needle hissed as the power surged and died. The romantic glow was instantly replaced by the harsh red strobes of the mansion's silent alarm. A muffled explosion rocked the foundations, causing the crystal glasses on the table to shatter. "Get down!" Fang roared, his voice returning to the iron-cold command of the Mafia boss. He tackled Grace to the floor just as a hail of gunfire shredded the library windows, glass raining down like lethal diamonds. "Fang, what's happening?" Grace screamed, her ears ringing from the blast. "The serpents," he hissed, pulling a handgun from a hidden compartment under the sofa. His face was a mask of stone. "They followed you. They waited for the storm to mask their entry." He grabbed her arm, dragging her toward a reinforced panic room hidden behind the bookshelves. But as he shoved her inside, he didn't follow. "Fang, no, come inside!" He looked at her, and for a split second, the man she had kissed was there, bleeding and terrified for her. Then he killed that man. He hardened his gaze until he looked like a stranger. "This is why you don't belong here, Grace," he spat, his words hitting harder than the bullets outside. "I was a fool to bring you back. You're a liability. A weakness I can't afford. I don't love you. I just wanted to see if I still had a heart. I don't." "You're lying," she cried, reaching for him, but he slammed the heavy steel door. "I'm letting you go for good this time." His voice came through the intercom, cold and distant. "My men will escort you out through the tunnels once the perimeter is clear. Don't look back. You're nothing to me but a ghost." The sound of his heavy boots running toward the gunfire echoed through the speaker. Grace collapsed. Against the cold steel door, the silence of the bunker more deafening than the war raging outside. She had been invited for Christmas, only to be discarded in the dark. The air in the tunnel was damp and smelled of old concrete. Two of Fang's elite guards stood at the end of the corridor, gesturing toward the hidden exit that led to the snowy woods. "Mr. Kim's orders, Miss Grace. We take you to the safe house, then you're free. You never have to see him again." Grace stopped. Her heart was a drum of rebellion. She looked at the exit, the safety she had claimed to want for 3 years. Then she looked back at the heavy steel door of the bunker. She remembered the scar on his back. She remembered the way his hand trembled when he touched her. "He's a liar," she whispered. "Miss?" the guard asked, confused. "He's a damn liar," Grace shouted. She didn't run for the exit. She turned and sprinted back toward the mansion, her heels clattering against the stone until she kicked them off, running barefoot. She knew the layout. She had memorized it in her dreams. She burst into the main hall. The smell of ozone and copper was thick. Fang was leaning against the grand staircase, his charcoal sweater soaked a darker red at the shoulder. He was alone, his gun empty, surrounded by the shadows of a dozen fallen men. The front doors were kicked in, the snow blowing into the foyer, covering the marble in a white shroud. Fang looked up, his face pale. "I told you to go," he wheezed. Grace walked toward him, ignoring the danger, ignoring the blood. She knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "You don't get to decide for me anymore, Fang. You don't get to protect me by breaking me. I'm not leaving you to die in this cold house alone." "Grace." He choked out, his pride finally crumbling as he leaned his forehead against hers. "I'm losing everything. The syndicate. The power. It's over." "Good," she whispered, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "I didn't come back for a mafia boss. I came back for you." The morning sun broke over the horizon, turning the blood-stained snow of the estate into a field of shimmering diamonds. The sirens of the authorities were a distant hum, but the mansion was silent now. Fang sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, a bandage clumsily wrapped around his shoulder. He wasn't looking at his burning empire or the investigators crawling over his grounds. He was looking at Grace, who stood in the open doorway, breathing in the crisp, cold air. He stood up, his movements slow and pained, and walked toward her. He reached into the pocket of his ruined sweater and pulled out the small velvet box Grace had seen in the library. He didn't drop to a knee. He didn't need the theatrics of a boss. He simply took her hand. "I gave everything up," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "The titles, the money, the protection. I made a deal to turn over the council. I have nothing left but a name that people will eventually forget." Grace looked at the ring, a simple gold band with a tiny, radiant diamond, and then up at the man who had nearly died to keep her at a distance. She saw the scar on his jaw, the weariness in his eyes, and the quiet hope that had finally replaced the cold steel. "You have everything," she said softly, sliding the ring onto her finger, "because you finally have yourself." 3 months later, a small flower shop on the edge of the city opened its doors early. A tall man with a slight limp and a quiet disposition moved boxes of white carnations into the display window. He didn't wear $5,000 suits anymore. He wore a simple apron and a look of profound peace. Grace stepped out from the back, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and leaned against his good shoulder. "Happy anniversary," she whispered. Fang pulled her close, kissing her temple as the city woke up around them. They were no longer a boss and his ghost. They were just 2 souls who had found their way through the dark to a love they never expected, but finally deserved. True love isn't about the power you hold, but the person you'd give it all up for. If you believe everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional stories.